Okay, continuing on. The idea that because Native Americans had no concept of individual land ownership, their land was not owned by anyone. Thus, it was thought that the first European nation to discover land occupied only by Native Americans could assert sovereignty over that territory. This self-serving conclusion, however, was actually a manipulation of the principles of customary international law that had developed before the discovery of the New World and should not have been applied to territories occupied by Native Americans. The doctrine of discovery only applies to terra nullius, land owned by no one, which the lands of North America definitely were not. The International Court of Justice ruled that land claimed by Spain was not subject to the doctrine of discovery because it was not terra nullius. Nomads who possessed a degree of social and political organization inhabited the territory. When these principles are applied to the territory of the 1851-1868 treaties, and historical and legal analysis suggests that France's claim to North America and consequently its claim to sovereignty over Sioux territory was invalid and completely erroneous. The territory at issue was possessed and inhabited by the Sioux or other Native American Indian nations. Thus, it was not terra nullius, and therefore not subject to the doctrine of discovery. Furthermore, any claim by French may have had was certainly never consummated through occupation. Thus, the Louisiana Purchase could not effect the transfer of Sioux land to the United States when France had no legal claim to Sioux land. United States case law of the Marshall Court, which established the federal doctrine of discovery, reveals that the doctrine was actually a limit on European nations with little real consequence for indigenous American nations. And there's a reference to that. The United States Supreme Court has admitted that it is fair to interpret treaties with Indian tribes only as the Indians would have understood them. Thus, any provision in these treaties declaring the sovereignty of the United States over Sioux lands should not be viewed in a vacuum as evidencing or establishing a surrender of Sioux sovereignty to the United States. Instead, these provisions need to be viewed in the overall context of history, including the nature of negotiations and the existence of the Sioux Nation as an independent and sovereign state. Furthermore, these negotiations took place in the shadow of a large show of military force by the United States. As to the 1868 treaty, Article 2 of the treaty, Fort Laramie 1868 reference, established a Great Sioux Reservation as it became known, setting aside all present-day South Dakota west of the Missouri River, including the Black Hills, for the absolute and undisturbed use and occupation of the Sioux. Article 6 also designated the contested Powder River country north of the Platte River and east of the summits of the Bighorn Mountains as unceded Indian territory where no man could tread without the consent of the Sioux. A clearer statement of Sioux sovereignty could not be imagined from the perspective of the Sioux. The United States, however, self-serving or condescending its ulterior motives, agreed to the terms of the Sioux Nation. The fact that Sioux territory was designated as a reservation in the treaty by the United States does not alter the legality of Sioux sovereignty over its domain. These procedures are indistinguishable from those used by the United States for entering into treaties with other foreign nations and suggest an intention to create a binding international treaty. Thus, under customary international law, the United States undertook a duty to perform its obligations under the treaty in good faith and not to defeat the purpose of the treaty. As a reference, and treaties are binding agreements that must be upheld and respected in good faith. This is a principle of customary international law that undoubtedly predated the establishment of the United States. Further, it is the foundation of all international agreements. As such, it undoubtedly binds the United States to perform obligations that the United States voluntarily gives its word to perform. The United States solemnly agreed that no unauthorized person shall ever be permitted to pass over, settle upon, or reside in this territory. In regard to the Black Hills, having promised the Sioux that the Black Hills were reserved to them, the United States Army was placed in the position of having to threaten military force and occasionally use it to prevent prospectors and settlers from trespassing on lands reserved to the Sioux. Eventually, the executive branch of the government decided to abandon the United States treaty obligation to preserve the integrity of the Sioux territory. In a letter dated November 9, 1875, to Brigadier General Alfred H. Terry, commander of the Department of Dakota, Sheridan reported that he had met with President Grant, the Secretary of the Interior, and the Secretary of War, and that the President had decided that the military should make no further resistance to the occupation of the Black Hills by miners. Finally, when faced with Sioux protests that 3/4 of adult males had not signed the agreement, as required by Article 12 of the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the United States ignored the Sioux Nation's territorial integrity and established rights to their land and illegally usurped the Black Hills by a unilateral act of Congress. In sum, these actions clearly constitute violations of the international law of treaties, the Vienna Convention. There's a reference there, where a treaty shall be interpreted in good faith. Furthermore, these actions quite possibly constitute genocide by contemporary standards. The United States has no justification for these actions under international law. The United States cannot argue any provisions of its international law, of its internal law, as excuse for failures to perform the treaty. Thus, any shift in the United States policy regarding Indian tribes in general, or any argument that Congress has power to abrogate every treaty, does not relieve the United States of its obligation under international law. Finally, the agreement of 1876 between the United States and the Sioux cannot be valid as superseding the 1868 treaty. First, the Seller-Starve agreement was clearly forced upon the Sioux without their free and voluntary consent, and thus cannot be considered a binding agreement, contract, or treaty under the Vienna Convention. In the same regard, it cannot be considered a termination of the 1868 treaty. The 1876 agreement was executed by Congress as merely a unilateral order of the United States attempting to formalize and legalize its illegal treatment of the Sioux Nation. The reward of money is totally inadequate. The Sioux Nation's land was not for sale.